On the morning of the 15th of January 2026, the United States Supreme Court did something that went unnoticed by most Americans, but could redefine the balance of powers in the country. Once again, it did not decide. For the second consecutive week, the justices left in suspension one of the most important constitutional questions of the modern era: whether a president can unilaterally impose commercial tariffs using national emergency powers. Legal scholars note that repeated delays have had the practical effect of allowing executive policies to remain in place. The court has, in multiple instances, allowed controversial Trump administration policies to proceed through provisional decisions while postponing definitive judgments that could restrict presidential power. Today, we examine how these delays are creating a zone of constitutional uncertainty that could alter the American balance of powers. On the 20th of January 2025, President Trump began his second term with a series of unprecedented executive orders. Among them, the imposition of 10% tariffs on virtually all imports, using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law intended for national emergencies. In March 2025, companies like Costco and Learning Resources sued the federal government, questioning whether Trump had constitutional authority to impose these tariffs without congressional approval. In June, the court rejected requests for an immediate decision, scheduling oral arguments for November. During the November hearings, observers noted that justices from both ideological tendencies expressed skepticism about the extent of presidential powers invoked. Justice Neil Gorsuch, according to court transcripts, questioned whether the migration of power from the legislative to the executive had exceeded constitutional limits. The decision was expected for the 8th of January 2026. It did not come. It was expected for January 15. It also did not come. The court simply announced that its next decision session would be the following week without explanations. In parallel, the Trump administration removed members of independent agencies, including senior officials from the Federal Trade Commission in March 2025 and from the Federal Reserve Board in August. Lower courts blocked these removals, but the Supreme Court allowed them to proceed through provisional orders while scheduling hearings for January and February 2026. To understand the magnitude of this situation, it is necessary to examine how the Constitution structures these powers. Article 1 grants Congress exclusive authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Article 2 grants the president executive power, including conducting foreign policy. For 90 years, since Humphrey's Executor v. United States 1935, the Supreme Court established that presidents cannot remove commissioners from independent agencies at will, only for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. This unanimous decision created a category of federal officials protected from direct political influence. Regarding tariffs, Congress historically delegated limited powers to the president through specific laws like the Trade Act of 1974 and the IEEPA of 1977. The IEEPA requires a real national emergency for activation of extraordinary economic powers. Legal precedent also established that the Supreme Court can issue provisional decisions through the shadow docket for urgent matters, but these historically were rare and limited. Critics argue that expanded use of the shadow docket has shifted the balance of power, while others maintain it remains a procedural necessity for urgent matters. What differentiates this moment from previous constitutional crises are three factors: the scale of the policies in question, the speed of implementation, and the increased reliance on provisional rulings. Professor Erwin Chemerinsky of UC Berkeley documented that between January and December 2025, the Supreme Court issued at least 24 provisional decisions involving Trump administration action. In 20 of these decisions, the court allowed the policies to remain in effect, allowing policies to proceed while cases await definitive judgment. This pattern represents a notable shift from the historical approach of the court. Historians often point to United States v. Nixon as an example of expedited judicial action during constitutional crises, though the political context today differs significantly. During the Watergate era, the court decided United States versus Nixon in just 4 months, quickly rejecting claims of absolute executive privilege. Legal analysts observe that each week of delay strengthens the de facto precedent of presidential policies. JP Morgan analysts noted in client communications that each week the Supreme Court delays its decision increases the likelihood of the Trump administration prevailing. Constitutional law professor Josh Blackman argued on the Vlog Conspiracy blog that lower court judges are now confident they can issue any order they wish against the executive branch, and the Supreme Court will not stop them. Other scholars warn that this raises questions about judicial-executive relations. The impacts of this dynamic are multifaceted. Institutionally, this pattern could fundamentally reshape the balance of powers. If the court ultimately upholds broad presidential authority in cases about tariffs and removal of commissioners, future presidents would have significantly expanded executive powers. Politically, the delay has benefited the current administration while potentially affecting future presidents of different parties. Each month that tariffs remain in effect establishes practical precedents for unilateral executive action. Economically, business uncertainty has increased. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent admitted in a recent interview that potential tariff refunds could reach hundreds of billions, calling it a complete mess if the court decides against the administration. Surveys show that Trump's approval ratings declined from 52% in January 2025 to 42% in December, following historical patterns where presidents lose political capital over time. This timing could influence how the court ultimately rules in pending cases. Looking ahead, analysts identify several possible scenarios. The court could rule against Trump's tariff authority but allow limited presidential removal powers. This mixed outcome would be consistent with historical patterns, where the court limits some executive powers while expanding others. Alternatively, the court could uphold both tariff authority and expanded removal powers, fundamentally reshaping executive branch authority. Legal experts suggest this would represent the most significant expansion of presidential power since the New Deal era. A third possibility is that the court could continue delaying definitive rulings, effectively allowing current policies to remain while avoiding constitutional pronouncements. This approach would preserve flexibility but increase institutional uncertainty. Analysts note that timing matters significantly. If the court delays major rulings until June 2026, when the current term ends, implementation challenges could affect practical outcomes regardless of legal holdings. What to watch in the coming weeks are the actual decisions, not just public statements. If the court continues issuing provisional orders that favor executive power while delaying definitive constitutional rulings, this could suggest different approaches to judicial-executive relations. Historical precedents suggest that justices often wait until presidents lose political capital before issuing major restrictions on executive power. Nixon resigned 4 days after United States v. Nixon. Steele seizure cases emerged during declining Truman popularity, most notably Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer. Whether similar timing patterns apply today remains an open question. Watch for several indicators. Whether Trump's approval ratings continue declining, whether Congress begins asserting institutional prerogatives more aggressively, and whether lower courts become more willing to issue definitive rulings against executive actions. These decisions matter for American democracy because they establish precedents that constrain or expand future presidential power regardless of party affiliation. Constitutional structures, once altered, rarely return to previous configurations. The fundamental question remains whether American institutions can adapt to exercises of executive power that test traditional constitutional boundaries, or whether such adaptations fundamentally alter the nature of separated powers government. The answer emerging through these cases may influence how presidential authority is interpreted for years to come.